Hello, I'm Brian Gallagher, the author of Taking Sides, and I was asked to talk to you today about the Civil War in Ireland and how I used that as the backdrop to my novel. So the book had an interesting birth in the sense that it almost never saw the light of day. I'd written a book called Across the Divide, which is a story set during the lockout in Dublin in 1913. And I'd gone to my publisher, O'Brien Press, and I suggested to them that maybe we'd take the characters from that story and look at them across the 10-year period from 1913 to 1923. So we'd look at the lockout first, then we'd look at the Easter Rising, and then we'd look at the Civil War. And I thought that might be a nice journey to see how that family coped with all those events. But the publisher said no, they'd had lots of books in 1916, that had been done a lot, and they weren't really interested in that. But they did like the idea of a book on the Civil War because that hadn't been done very much. So I said, okay, in that case, I'll do the book on the Civil War. Actually, I did subsequently write a book set in 1916, but I concentrated at that point on the Civil War book. And I knew it was a tricky subject. Maybe that's why there weren't many books written on it, because even 100 years later, it's still a sensitive, divisive issue, the Civil War, naturally enough, because families were divided. And an interesting thing happened with a friend of mine who read the book, and this was now 90 years after the Civil War had ended. And I had been at pains when I was drawing up my characters to try to be fair, to try to show each side of the divide and try to give the arguments that each side would have put forward. And I thought I'd been even-handed. But when he read the book, he said to me, "Oh, you were a bit hard on the rebels." And I thought, was I? I don't think I was. But then it transpired that he had an uncle, and his uncle's whole life had been affected by the Civil War. He'd never really recovered from it, and that had coloured my friend's thinking of the book. So it struck me that even after 90 years, this was a subject that people felt sensitive about. And it also brought home to me something that I'd known as a writer anyway, and that is that when you've written a story, you've written the story as you saw it, but other people will bring their own prejudice, their own emotions to the story, and you have to just let go of the book because they will bring things to it. They will see in it things that you never intended. But that's all part of being a writer. You have to send your baby out into the world and let it take its place, as whatever way that pans out. So anyway, that was my starting point. I decided that I would take a group of characters from both sides of the divide and tell their story. But I wanted to have another element of drama in the story, and that was the class divide. Because I thought the more elements of drama you can weave into a novel, the more interesting it is for the reader. So I decided that Peter Scanlon, my main male character, who is working for the rebels, would be a middle-class boy who lives in a nice house in Glasnevin and goes to Belvedere College. But his friend, Annie, comes from a much more humble background, and she wins a scholarship to go to Ecclestre College, which is a really big break for her. And his activity and their relationship puts her at risk, puts her whole future at risk in terms of if she loses her scholarship, her whole life is going to be affected by it. So I thought that would give an extra element of drama to the story. And I thought that would make it a more interesting journey for those two characters. So what I then did was I looked at the chronology. I have some notes here on the Civil War. I looked at the chronology of the Civil War and I decided when would I set my story. So I opened the story a year before the Civil War when the Black and Tans were here, an action scene to show Peter getting drawn into the conflict. And then a year later, he's still on the side of the rebels. So it was, the year 1922 was a very dramatic year. And I have some of the things here. Like we had the first general election in Ireland, and most of the people voted for parties who were in favour of the treaty. And the rebels didn't accept that result. So then you had the rebels occupying the forecourts. You had the Civil War breaking out, the rebels occupying Cork and Limerick and Waterford. They were retaken. The government troops took Cork. They sailed down on ships and took Cork. And then you had the death of Michael Collins. And I knew that would be a big scene in my story. I'd actually seen Pathé News film of footage of Michael Collins' funeral in O'Connell Street. And it was very moving. I was very moved myself watching it. And I thought that would be an interesting scene in the book because Peter, my rebel boy, idolised Michael Collins during the War of Independence. But now Michael Collins was the commander-in-chief of the army against whom he was fighting. So he would have been conflicted. And I thought, that's the kind of thing that happens in real life. So even though Collins is the commander-in-chief of the other side, Peter, when he sees the funeral, finds himself in tears. So I thought they're the kind of elements I want to have in the book. And then the other stuff I was looking at for that year, by the end of the year, the last British troops left Ireland, and the Irish army was really big. There were 38,000 men in the army by the end of that year. That's about 3 times the size of our present defence forces. So I thought all of those elements were there for me to play around with. And I had to decide which elements of the story I would use, which elements of history I would use, and what time period. So I decided I would start the story in May of that year and finish it in November. So that was the backdrop against which the story was going to unfold. And then the other thing I use when I'm telling a story is I like to try to recreate the world as it was then. So I would look at other things that were happening in the world during that period, like Roald de Munson, the polar explorer. He set out on a trip to the North Pole. The BBC was formed. The first ever news broadcast, the first time ever the news was read out on the radio, that also happened in 1922. The first US senator who was female was elected in 1922. Now, sometimes I'll use these facts in the story and sometimes I won't, but it's nice to have that kind of background to try and recreate the world of Dublin and Ireland in 1922. The other thing I like to use is music. So I looked up, because life goes on, even amongst the turmoil of the Civil War, normal life goes on, and people are learning how to play the piano and play the tunes of the day and listening to records. So I went back and I looked at what were the records of the day, and there were things like I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles and Won't You Come Home, Bill Bailey, kind of music hall songs, Don't Dilly Dally on the Way, After You're Gone. Great songs, some of which we would still know today. So I wove those into the story as well. And then the last thing that happened in terms of my research, a bit of good fortune from my point of view, was I had gone online and I'd gone to libraries and I'd read up all about the period, but I happened to be listening to the radio one Sunday morning, and a woman called Ethna Barrer was on RTE, and my story was set in 1920s in Eccles Street Convent, and she started talking about going to Eccles Street Convent in the 1920s. I couldn't believe my good luck. Here was someone who had actually lived through what I was going to write about. And normally when I'm writing books, if it's at all possible, I will talk to people who lived through the period. But I write historical fiction, so in most cases, there's nobody still alive. But Ethna Barrer was still alive. So as soon as the programme ended, I said, I have to talk to that woman. And I looked up her telephone number in the directory, and she was listed. I rang her subsequently and I said, is there any chance I could meet you for 15 minutes and we could have a chat? And she said, absolutely no problem, come over to my house. So I went over to her house in Glasnevin and we met for much more than 15 minutes. We had a great chat, and she told me all about her childhood, that the black and tans used to sit on the wall outside her house. She had great stories, and she told me all about going to Eccles Street as a girl in the 1920s. So I was able to use that. And I was able to get details from her that you won't get in a history book. So for instance, she was telling me that she used to walk down through Phibsborough going to school to Eccles Street, past Doyle's Corner. And she said she used to always step off the pavement going by the pub on the corner and walk on the road. And I said, why did you do that? And she said, because there were swing doors on the pub, and if you were going by and the swing doors open, the smell of the beer would come out, and it was a really strong smell, and it would go up her nostrils, and she hated that. So that's the kind of little detail you won't get in a history book, and I actually used that in the story. So it was terrific to meet somebody like that and be able to use that material in bringing the book to life. So having got all that ready, you've all your research done, the day does come then obviously when you have to stop researching, sit down, face the blank page and start writing the story. And usually, in my case, it would take me maybe 3 months to do the first draft of a novel like this. So I would often start maybe in September, having done my research over the summer, work for about 3 months and try to get it finished by Christmas. And then what I do is I let the book cool down. I don't look at it, I take a break. I spend Christmas with my family and friends, and then in January, I'd come back to it with a really cold, hard eye, and I would edit it very hard. I would go through and I would cut out everything that wasn't earning its keep to try and make the story as fast-moving and tight and exciting as I possibly can. And then I sent the book in to my editor. They came back with all sorts of queries. Are you sure that song was a hit in 1922? Checking all those little details. And then when we had everything ready, the book went off to be typeset. Then it came back to me one last time, and that's your final bite at the cherry. So you go through it very, very carefully, because any mistakes that are in the book now are there permanently, and you don't want that. So I went through it very carefully one more time, and then the book went off to be published. And then, or to be printed, I should say. And then it came back to me just before publication. That's always a really nice day. You get 10 copies of the book, your author's copies, and I usually lay them out on the table, and I just take a little moment to kind of pat myself on the back, as it were, and enjoy the moment, because something sort of magical has happened here. A year ago, this was notes written on scraps of paper, and now after all the blood, sweat and tears of writing the book on the Civil War, you actually have something in your hand, something tangible. And then the book gets published, it goes out into the world, it's going to be reviewed in newspapers, you'll be on the radio, and you hope people will like it. But actually, at this stage, you've got to let it go, because there's nothing more you can do. You've given it your best shot, and that's it. And usually by then, I would be starting to do the preparation for my next book. So it's, in one way, it's kind of easy to let the book go at that point. So that's the backdrop to how I approach my Civil War novel. And I thought now I'd maybe read you a scene from the book to give you a flavour of what the story is like. So I'm going to read a scene where Peter is involved in a raid, where the National Army are raiding a house looking for illicit weapons. So, Peter felt excited. It was always a thrill to be on a mission, and tonight he was cycling along a fog-covered country road en route to meet Ned Morgan, the owner of Willow Cottage. He imagined that this was what it must have been like, serving in the flying columns that used to strike suddenly against the black and tans, then disappear into the countryside during the guerrilla warfare of the War of Independence. Guerrilla warfare was going to be the way of the future, now that the main cities had been retaken by the army. Peter believed, however, that the rebels could make the country ungovernable. Then they could force the government to renegotiate the treaty with Britain and so still acquire a full republic. This morning he'd received a request from Mr. Mack to move another consignment of contraband from the cottage to the hiding place in the Botanic Gardens. It was fairly urgent, the school teacher had said, breaking his normal rule by calling Peter aside in Belvedere, as the government forces were frequently raiding the homes and farms of suspected rebel sympathisers. Peter had promised to do it tonight, and the timing had been good, with his mother caught up in her Friday night bridge and his father in Cork at a dental conference. His older brother and sister usually went into town on Friday nights, and so Peter had been able to slip out unnoticed. He cycled now along Ballyboggan Road, the front light on his bike barely illuminating the foggy route ahead. When he'd left Glasnevin, the fog had been lighter, but here in the countryside it had grown thicker, and he had to cycle more slowly. He rounded a bend, and being familiar with the route, he realised he wasn't too far from Cardiff's Bridge. He continued on through the fog and saw faintly visible lights at the next bend on the road. He heard a soft rumble of engines turning over. Then the sound ceased as first one engine and then another was switched off. Peter braked at once, immediately on the alert. Lorries travelling at this hour of the evening might very well be taking part in a raid. Peter dismounted, then proceeded quietly on foot, anxious to see what was going on. He felt his pulses beginning to race, and the thought occurred to him that if the lorries really were part of a raid, it was highly likely that Willow Cottage was the target. The smart course of action would be to slip away now to avoid a trap. But if the lorries really were full of soldiers about to launch a raid, did he not have a duty to try and warn his comrades? He stood there a moment, uncertain what to do, then made up his mind. He would find out if the lorries really were military vehicles before deciding anything. He switched off his light, then walked gingerly ahead, wheeling the bicycle. He was glad now of the ever-thickening fog and the lack of other traffic on the road at this hour of the evening. Drawing nearer, he felt his heart sink. Both vehicles were army trucks. He could faintly make out the outlines of a man standing at the cab of the nearest vehicle. Then he heard his voice. "It's not marked on the map," said the soldier, "but there's supposed to be a turn before the bridge." That settled it, thought Peter. The army was preparing to raid the cottage. He stepped back into the fog for fear that the soldier might look up from the map and see him. He knew he'd had a near miss and that he should get out of here fast. If he fled now, though, the soldiers would catch Ned red-handed with whatever weapons he had ready for Peter to take away. Could he get to the cottage first and warn him? He definitely couldn't risk trying to cycle past the army lorries. But supposing he ran across the fields, it might be possible to get there ahead of the troops. It was a big risk, and there was no telling what would happen if it backfired and he was captured. Or worse, he could be shot during the raid. Things like that happened all the time. The thought of being shot really frightened him, but he hated the idea of slinking off home and leaving Ned to be captured. He weighed up his choices, then acted impulsively. Moving quickly but quietly, he wheeled the bicycle back to a gate that he'd passed. On the other side of the gate were fields that led down to the river, and without hesitating any further, he hoisted the bicycle up in the air and lowered it down on the other side of the gate. He swiftly climbed over the gate and slipped off the bicycle's front lamp. Then he hid the bike where he could retrieve it later, resting it out of sight behind a hedgerow. The fog was even thicker towards the River Talca, but Peter knew these fields well from his many picnics there. Using the bicycle lamp to pick out a route, he made his way down the sloping field towards the river as quickly as he could. He took care not to shine the light in the direction of the road, and he prayed the fog would prevent him from being spotted by the soldiers. Despite the cold night air, he was sweating, and the hair in the back of his neck stood on end when he thought of what it would be like to get a bullet in the back. No shots were fired, however, and to his relief, he reached the track that ran alongside the river. Picking up his pace, he ran through the swirling fog. Even with the poor visibility, he knew exactly where he was, and before reaching Cardiff's Bridge, he cut left across a pasture, quickly scaled the gate, and dropped down onto the road. He ran up the lane leading to Willow Cottage, hit the latch on the first door, and burst into the living room. "God Almighty," cried Ned as he spun around from where he was sitting at the table. The older man had been drinking tea from an enamel mug, and some of the tea had splashed onto his shirt with the shock of Peter's sudden arrival. There wasn't time to apologise or explain, however, and Peter spoke rapidly. "You're going to be raided." "How do you know? The army are just up the road," cried Peter, cutting him short. Then the sound of revving engines could be heard. "That's them," said Peter. "Have you got the stuff for me?" "Yes," said Ned, overcoming his initial shock and swiftly rising from the table. He went to a wicker basket full of sods of turf. He reached under the top sods and pulled out a package sealed with sacking and thrust it into Peter's hands. Peter could hear the sound of the trucks changing gear, and he knew they were coming down the nearby hill, but he forced himself not to panic. "Have you anything else they shouldn't find?" he asked. "No, that's it. You run out the back, through the barn. I'll brazen it out here." "Right. Good luck, son. Run like the wind." Peter opened the door, the back door to the kitchen, and ran down a passageway, then through another door and out into the barn. He heard the sound of the trucks pulling into the lane, then skidding to a halt at the front of the cottage. There were shouts and whistles being blown, but he concentrated on finding the rear door of the barn, using the beam from the bicycle lamp. He heard the door of the cottage being kicked open as he stepped out the back of the barn into the fog-enshrouded night. He was now on the side of the barn furthest from the cottage front entrance, but he was still only a short distance away from the shouting soldiers. His heart pounded so heavily that his chest felt like it was going to burst, but he resisted the temptation to flee. Ned had said to run like the wind, but that wasn't possible in the fog. And running through the farmyard might well alert the soldiers, some of whom he heard fanning out around the cottage. Instead, he switched off the lamp and slowly stepped backwards into the shelter of an apple orchard. Eased back as deeply as he could into the apple trees, being careful not to snap any fallen branches. Suddenly, two soldiers burst out the rear of the barn, one of them carrying a lantern. Peter could make out their shape in the thick fog, but he hoped that by standing immobile in the fog, he would not be seen. He heard angry voices from the cottage. Then Ned cried out, presumably having been struck a blow. Peter hoped they wouldn't mistreat him any further. Then his thoughts were turned to self-preservation. The soldier carrying the lantern was moving up the yard, drawing closer to Peter's hiding place. Peter's every instinct was to draw away, but he knew that any movement would be a mistake. Instead, he held his breath, hoping the soldier wouldn't spot him in the heavy, swirling mist. The soldier stopped. "Here, Paddy," he cried. "Guess what I've found?" Peter felt his mouth go dry. Was the man playing cat and mouse with him? "What is it?" said the other soldier. "Something that means we haven't wasted our time." "I can't see anything," said the second soldier. "I can, though." Peter felt his knees trembling and he pressed them together. "What is it?" repeated the second soldier. "Something you find in orchards. Apples." Peter watched in disbelief as the lantern holder plucked an apple off one of the trees and threw it to his friend. "Here," he cried laughingly. "Spoils of war." Then he plucked another apple for himself before both men turned away and headed back into the barn. Peter felt a wave of relief and he breathed out deeply but silently. Time to get out of here, he thought. He didn't like leaving Ned with the enemy soldiers, but the older man had said there was nothing else illegal in the house, so he should be all right. The soldiers would probably turn the cottage upside down, searching for contraband, which meant they would be there for quite a while. All he had to do now was retreat deeper into the fog and make his way through the fields parallel to the road. Once he was well away from the cottage, he would regain the road and run back to where he'd hidden the bicycle. All going well, he should be back in Glasnevin before the soldiers had to admit there was nothing to be found. He breathed out more deeply again, his relief giving way to exhilaration. Then he grasped the precious parcel for which he'd come and disappeared into the trees. So that's it. I hope that gives some insight into how a writer fashions a story using material as dramatic as the Irish Civil War as background information. So thank you for watching, and until we meet again, goodbye.